Okay, so let's start with UFO crash retrievals, some testimony. I'm going to talk a little bit for a while about Robert Sarbacher. A lot of you know who he was. Robert Sarbacher was a very brilliant, probably genius level scientist. Um, he had an incredibly high IQ. I can't remember what it supposedly was, and besides, IQs are measured a little differently these days. But suffice to say, he was an exceptionally brilliant man who uh, his main field was physics, but he was a consultant for the Department of Defense's Research and Development Board back in the 1950s, which simply meant that he was in an extremely prominent position to consult with the highest levels of the Department of Defense on matters of UFO and related important areas of science. So there's a few things I want to say about Robert Sarbacher's knowledge. Back in 1950, in September, the Canadian scientist and government bureaucrat, um, Wilbert Smith, who worked with the Canadian Department of Transportation. Smith was another brilliant man, and he was interested in the flying saucers that were being discussed in 1950. And on this occasion, he was able to go down to Washington, D.C., and through the Canadian embassy was able to meet with Robert Sarbacher. And they had a long conversation. None of this came out right away. This all took years and actually decades. But essentially, Smith and Sarbacher sit down, and Sarbacher tells Smith that regarding flying saucers or UFOs, that this matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, which in 1950, there was nothing officially bigger than the hydrogen bomb in terms of security. This was a massive thing. Here's Sarbacher telling Smith, no, this flying saucer business is bigger than the H-bomb. They do exist, he said. We don't know how they operate, he said, but a concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. Showed an image of Bush in my last lecture. He was Franklin Roosevelt's top science advisor, and then when Harry Truman became president, he was Harry Truman's top science advisor. Bush was a combination. He was a scientist of a high caliber, but he was also a manager of a high caliber. He had both of those skill sets in a very excellent amount, and so he was a perfect individual to go at the very top of the national security scientific establishment. And then Sarbacher said to Smith, the entire matter is considered by the U.S. government to be of tremendous significance. But that's not all Robert Sarbacher said on UFOs. In Smith's handwritten notes. So Smith actually took this conversation and typed up a memo to his supervisors in the Canadian government. And this memo was not discovered until the 1970s, late 70s. Years after that, in the early 80s, there was a Canadian researcher named Arthur Bray who was going through Smith's papers in Ottawa, where they were being stored, and he found Smith's handwritten notes of this memo with Sarbacher. And that's how we got Sarbacher's name out, because before that, no one knew that this was who the scientist was that Smith had spoken to. And in the handwritten notes, Sarbacher said to Smith, all we know is we didn't make them, and it's pretty certain they didn't originate on the Earth. So again, this is 1950. After Sarbacher's name came out, a number of UFO researchers tried to find him. He lived into the mid-1980s. Stanton Friedman found Sarbacher in 1983, and Sarbacher says to Friedman, I was told that they had recovered a UFO with some people in it. And then to another researcher in 1983, William Steinman, Sarbacher, he's now quite old at this point, and he writes a 2-page typed single-space memo to Steinman. And he's talking about the program as he understood it. He said, John von Neumann was definitely involved. And for the record, von Neumann is on the short list of anyone who thinks about this as possibly the most brilliant genius who's ever lived in human history. Neumann was a freak of nature in terms of his intelligence and was a mathematician of the highest caliber. He could run circles around anyone, and he was more than just a mathematician. He was in everything. He was the true polymath who was just like this freak of nature, genius level guy. So here's Sarbacher saying John von Neumann was definitely involved. Dr. Vannevar Bush was definitely involved. And he said, I think Dr. Robert Oppenheimer also, and Oppenheimer, of course, in charge of the Manhattan Project. Saubacher goes on, he says, although I had been invited to participate in several discussions associated with the reported recoveries, I could not personally attend the meetings. I am sure that they would have asked Dr. von Braun, Werner von Braun. So this is Saubacher in 1983 writing to William Steinman. He goes on in this particular letter, I'm just quoting a little bit more. He says, I did receive some official reports when I was in my office at the Pentagon, but all of those were left there at the time, and we were never supposed to take them out of the office. Makes perfect sense. He goes on, he says, I took this assignment as a private contribution. We were called $1 a year men. And indeed, that was a very big thing for the World War II generation. A lot of these wealthy men who had established themselves volunteered their time for the U.S. government. They were known as $1 a year men. Saubacher was one of them. He goes on to say, certain materials reported to have come from flying saucer crashes, were extremely light and very tough. I am sure our laboratories analyzed them very carefully. Now, it's possible Saubacher could have been working off of some of the information about Roswell that was then starting to come out. We don't really know, but from everything that we have gathered about him, this is just Saubacher talking about it. It's not clear that he had read the William Moore book on Roswell at the time. He's just providing what seems to me to be independent confirmation. And then the last thing I'll mention from this letter, Saubacher says, there were reports, excuse me, that instruments or people operating these machines were also of very light weight. I remember in talking with some of the people that I got the impression these aliens were constructed like certain insects. So again, that's Saubacher, 1983. My very quick conclusion about this, you've got a genius level, well-placed physicist with high-level DoD connections from the 1950s. He's invited to UFO crash retrieval discussions, although he could not attend. He said he knew UFOs were the most classified subject in the US. He was told of alien beings and bodies and had informal information on some of the people and the materials that were involved. I thought that's all interesting.